December 1989, storyboards for Big House Blues began. The plot centered around Ren and Stimpy being picked up by a dog catcher and facing impending death through euthanasia. With Chris Felucci once again in charge, he focused the cartoon on each artist's strengths. He did Ren's freak-out moments, Lynn Naylor did the cuter moments, Jim Smith covered the more manly scenes, and for this episode, Bob Camp did the backgrounds because no one else could paint. John took the project seriously, and scenes were never shipped out as a whole, as he only sent them overseas after meeting his approval. Jordan Rychak, an assistant animator on this episode, said, quote, "All I knew about this Chris Felucci person was that many fellow students came back from their interviews with him in either emotional shock or tears. Bob Jakes was called upon to help. Jakes pressed the cartoon to have a more exaggerated style. John originally had it animated in the style of Ed Benedict from the easy 50s look of Hanna-Barbera. Voices on the episode were all handled in-house from people working on the cartoon, with Billy West being the only outsider. Billy at this time was a regular on the Howard Stern Show, and John loved that he could do a perfect Larry Fine impression. Quote, "He had already got an ass load of me during the Benny and Cecil days, and he was like, I want that Larry Fine." Music composer from Mighty Mouse, Glenn Daum, was chosen to score for the show, but refused to work after seeing a rough cut of the episode and citing the cartoon as distasteful. Henry Porch then pulled up the Associated Production music library, and him and John worked on picking out the songs. Jim Smith and Chris Riccardi were already musicians and had a band, Die Screaming Lederhosen, and were contacted to do music as well. Quote, "Chris Felucci wanted some crazy Chino-style music for the Dog Pound sequence," Riccardi said. He also wanted some gutsy blues stuff for the title card and end credits. When the show went to series, John convinced Nick to use those two pieces for the beginning and end titles, mainly as an alternative to what might have been really dumb theme songs. Jim Smith played guitar on the main theme, and Chris Riccardi did the bass. Work on Big House Blues ended in September 1990. The episode was done mainly as a way to screen to audiences to see if kids would like the product. After the screening, Vanessa calls John with the results. Quote, "John, I don't know how to tell you this, but the focus testing didn't do that well on Ren and Stimpy. The categories that the show didn't screen well in: cutting and editing. There was one area the show did better in, however. Quote, while the kids laughed more ears, they were laughing non-stop all the way through it. While Coffee was behind John and Spumco, others at Nickelodeon were very nervous about the show being marketed towards children. The other cartoons to premiere on Nick were Doug and Rugrats, which were much more kid-friendly, and Ren and Stimpy stuck out like a sore thumb. Quote, it was pretty risky. Everybody at Nickelodeon was kind of nervous about it," Coffee said. Quote, "I told Jerry if she would do the show, if it didn't work, she could fire me. So she said she would give me 6 half hours. That's why Doug and Rugrats had 13 initial at the time, because Nickelodeon was concerned." In October of 1990, production began on the first season of Ren and Stimpy. Word of Spumco had spread throughout Hollywood, and many wanted a chance to work at the studio, but John was very selective of who was hired. Newcomers were Jim Gomez, Teal Wang, and Vincent Waller, who got in by knowing Bob Camp since high school. Teal said, quote, "John offered me a full-time job, but I told him I was going back to The Simpsons. He looked at me and said, 'Oh, I get it. You like it safe. You don't like to take chances. I understand.' I got so pissed off I told him to fuck off and that I'd take his job. I was actually shaking. He knew exactly what he was doing. I only knew him 2 weeks, but he figured me out in 2 minutes. At the time, no more artists were needed, as Spumco was having enough troubles getting Nick to approve stories. An episode entitled The Wilderness Adventure was rejected in its entirety by Nick, and most of the other cartoons would spend an average of 2 months before Nick would approve them to move them into the storyboard phase. Because of this, the first season had not been fully written or storyboarded into March 1991. Adding to matters was the rule in Spumco of, quote, if you couldn't draw, you didn't count or matter. Chris Danzo said, quote, we finally realized that if John would go on a plane, go to New York, pitch everything verbally, all of a sudden they would get it. That was what they loved. But then they'd go back and draw it, and then it'd be like, oh, there's some objectionable stuff put in there that was never really discussed in the first place. Nurse Stimpy, for example, went through 5 rewrites before being allowed to be storyboarded. Nick was also less than thrilled with gross jokes, gritty kitty litter, and Stimpy's magic nose goblins. Bob Camp said, quote, that's his whole thing, to try and shock and offend people. He likes to play the victim, but that's the name of the game. Of course, if you put cartoons like that in the public eye, shit's gonna get cut out. Camp, however, could get just as passionate about the show as Chris Felucci, and even christened himself as John's, quote, right-hand asshole. He even threatened to strangle executives during the first meeting over the show's content. The night started out tame enough until story editor Mitchell Kriegman got on the topic of Camp's bad times working on Tiny Toons. This set Camp off, and things got even better when Nick exec Mary Harrington said, quote, who's this hillbilly biker guy? As a result, the very next day, Nick demanded that John fire Camp, or at least take his writing responsibilities away. John, being a big fan of Bob, instead just hid him from Nick execs for the next 6 months. At this time, Lynn Naylor also breaks up with John and leaves Spumco. She had been with John since the Sheridan College days. Work at Spumco was meticulous. Layout artists typically were given a section of the storyboards and explained what was required of them by John, sometimes with drawings done on the spot to emphasize a point. The first drawings were almost always revised by John. Once everything was finished, John gave the final okay on the scene as a whole. Sometimes an artist would do a scene 3 or 4 times before it was approved. Layout artist Mike Kim said, quote, I think a lot of us were petrified of him, but you could never learn as much in such a short period of time. This, coupled with Nick's disapproval of scenes or entire episodes, was pushing the show behind schedule. The entire Nicktoons slot was scheduled to air on August 11th, 1991, and by June of 91, scenes for the 3rd episode of 6 scheduled was sent to Carbuncle Cartoons for finalizing. Nick became overprotective of the show, as they felt John wouldn't deliver otherwise. John was sent a 30-page list of changes, quote, a month after we had shipped the first couple of episodes to be animated. And what were the changes about? 90% of them were to tell us that the scenes on the storyboards didn't hook up. Nick also hired someone to take note of all the changes from storyboard to layout, a job which he quit after barely a week, and even told Nick, quote, you have to convince the network that this is in their best interest in the long run. Let us spin gold for you. Stop trying to make us stop spinning gold for you. I'm there, and I know the long-term interest in everyone that it's better to make these shows good while we're all here. August 11th, Ren and Stimpy aired with Stimpy's Big Day and Big Shot Stimpy. The episode opens with the short introducing Log. Log was a combination of a pet rock and Mr. Potato Head, and the song was a parody of the Slinky theme from the 70s. John said, quote, I always thought logs were funny. My dad was really into wood. My dad hates to see a tree that's still standing. Something unnatural about that! So he has a collection of chainsaws. We had more wood and buildings than we had a building to live in. Bob Camp said, quote, "This is one of the first things I wrote and directed. I also wrote the song, which has some similarities to a famous toy jingle." We're also introduced to Muddy Mudskipper and Mr. Horse. On the 18th, with no other cartoon completed, Stimpy's Big Day re-aired. Camp said, quote, "From public record, the whole thing was fucked from the beginning. The stupid show didn't deliver. The second cartoon wasn't delivered, and they had to rerun the first cartoon. Quote, the show was just harder than we thought it was going to be to make," said Coffey. Nick changed their terms, and now a new episode was expected every other week. On the 25th, Robin Hoek and Nurse Stimpy aired. Starting the episode off is an ad for powdered toast. Quote, "I was just thinking up strange breakfast products to do commercials for," said John. "Well, I thought powdered toast might be a cool product, and then I remembered all these great cereal commercials from when I was a kid where Superman sold some. I don't remember which one it was. The kids would be feeling listless and stuff in the morning because they didn't have the right nutrition in the morning, and then Superman would overhear them. He'd be listening outside the window. Peeping Tom. He'd go, whoosh, come in through the window and save the kids. You need this cereal. It's chock full of sugar. It'll give you energy." So I just thought, well, if we're going to sell a breakfast cereal, we have to have some kind of superhero to help promote it. Why not Powdered Toast Man? Powdered Toast Man's voice was influenced by two sources. One being character Studebaker Hawk from Frank Zappa's song Billy the Mountain, and the other Gary Owens. Gary was a DJ back in the 60s for KMPC Los Angeles and was known for his surrealistic humor, such as coming up with the term Crenella Muffin and the colors of Weister and Krelb. Robin Hoek introduces us to George Liquor, another one of John's old characters he had around since 1979. Him and Lynn Naylor were driving through Van Nuys when, quote, there was a tiny liquor store with a big sign that read George Liquor. It didn't say George's Liquor, just George Liquor. It was the coolest name I ever heard. I love the idea that somebody could have a liquor store with a really professional sign, but the guy who ran it, you can understand, might not know what a possessive is. George was kept as a background character as he freaked out Nick. Nurse Stimpy turned out so bad, in John's opinion, he didn't even put his name on the project and signed off as Raymond Spum instead. September 8th, Space Madness and The Boy Who Cried Rat aired. Space Madness was the first of what Nick termed a psychodrama, and really showed what the show was capable of. Part of Ren's rant at the end of the cartoon about his ice cream bar was based on dialogue of Robert Mitchum from the movie The Night of the Hunter. A week later, The Littlest Giant aired. Quote, this story came out of a deal I made with Vanessa, said John. She didn't like the booger, fart, and gross jokes we wrote, so I asked her if I could trade them for something she wanted. She wanted heart. I was listening to the classical music in our APM stock music library and put on Clair de Lune by Debussy. I started picturing a sad scene with Stimpy in a fairy tale setting, and that became The Littlest Giant. I pitched the story idea to Vanessa while playing the music for her, and tears welled up in her eyes. She loved it. Spumco started not delivering on time again, with Fire Dogs airing on the 29th. With no other episode to accompany it, Nick just paired it with Big House Blues, much to John's disapproval. Months then went by before Marooned and A Cartoon were finally aired on December 29th. With episodes taking so long to produce, the show's ratings suffered, and it finished behind Doug and Rugrats. Spumco, however, was focusing much of its time on their ace in the hole, a cartoon entitled Stimpy's Invention. The idea for Stimpy's Invention came about in the initial writing sessions. Bob Camp came up with an idea for a short in which Stimpy makes Ren try all his inventions. Camp said John, quote, fell so in love with the idea that he constantly re-refined everything in it to the point of ridiculousness until everything was perfect. During the car ride home that same day, John said, "Look, why don't we have him have a real fit and go insane at one point, and then Stimpy decides he's going to make the invention that's going to cure Ren." It was fully storyboarded by Camp in February of '91, but Nick wanted scenes cut. Quote, "When they saw the storyboard, they just did not get it," said John. "Finally, I had to throw myself on my knees and just beg Coffee to let me to do it." One instance was over the scene where Stimpy uses a duck as a soldering gun. Quote, "They thought it looked too painful for a duck because it might hurt a duck to have his head do things to hard metal like this," said Vincent Lawler. Quote, "We could change it to a woodpecker because woodpeckers are used to having their beaks do things like this." John just sent back a note saying, "No." In his consuming rage to make this cartoon as perfect as possible, John became obsessive about details in it. It was originally scheduled for broadcast in October '91, but was in production past that. Chris Savino said, quote, "It didn't matter about the budget. It didn't matter about the deadline. As long as it was as funny as he wanted it and he made the audience laugh, then that's the way it's gonna be." One of the cartoon's biggest delays was the gift box that Stimpy gives to Ren. Teal Wang said, quote, "John told me to make it girly. I started mixing paint and gave him about 4 or 5 versions to choose from. This went on for about a month." Jerry Beck remembers the scene looked, quote, "like something out of The Shining." He remembers, quote, 4 walls filled with cells of one thing, but all different colors. The box that Stimpy gives Ren. At one point, John locked himself in his office, refusing to let the cartoon through until he had watched the entire episode to make sure it was how he wanted. When it was time to ship the episode overseas, Bob Jakes had had enough working in Asia his whole life and chose not to do the project, but he quickly had a change of heart when he saw Fire Dogs and realized how much Phil cartoons had ruined the episode. When he arrived at Phil in November, most of the work was unsalvageable, and he had to go back to the pencil test. At this time, strangely enough, Nick picked up Ren and Stimpy for a second season, even though the original 6 episodes ordered hadn't even been finished. In December 1991, MTV started airing episodes of Ren and Stimpy for 6 weeks. This is where the show picked up much of its popularity. Quote, "Nobody watched Nickelodeon," Bob Camp said. "It was out there, the kids saw it, but as soon as it started running on MTV, we got lots of calls from people who didn't even know it existed." When Black Hole and Stimpy's Invention finally aired on February 23, 1992, Nick had billed it as, quote, "a lost episode." Quote, "We thought it was lost forever," Coffee said. "I kept saying, 'John, where is it?'" Stimpy's Invention was a huge hit. It took what Space Madness showed and pushed it further. The drama pushes to the point of Stimpy playing his favorite record, the Happy Happy Joy Joy song. The song was composed by Chris Riccardi, and lyrics were done by Charlie Bissett and John. The character Stinky Whistleteats is a parody of Burl Ives, and Happy Happy Joy Joy even quotes songs of his and lines from the movie The Big Country. Quote, "I figured that I wanted to pack as much pure entertainment into that cartoon and not waste time with formula structure that usually includes formula filler," John said. "I figured Stimpy's Invention was over after the song. There was a big climax with Ren exploding, so let's just stop and leave everyone with their mouths hanging open. I didn't want the audience to settle down to calmness. I wanted them to crave more." In late March, things really sunk in that the show had taken off when Spumco appeared at Golden Apple Comics in LA. Quote, "We started getting closer to the store, and there were thousands of people lined around the block," Jake said. "It started at 2 and was supposed to go until 5:30. It ended at 9:30. Spumco was soon bombarded with offers of people wanting to do voices on the show, with at one point Robin Williams' agent calling. Quote, people would come in from Red Hot Chili Peppers and Fishbone in the middle of a workday, go visit with John, look at his stuff, and take off, said layout artist Ed Bell. John soon worried he'd become one of those, quote, people I see on the cover of People magazine, the ones whose eyes I want to gouge out. In an appearance in Time magazine in an April 13th article, John was misquoted. Quote, the writer made up things I didn't say, said John. He focused on the gross stuff and didn't even make it sound like there was anything funny to the program. He made it sound like we didn't have any redeeming quality to the show. He then turned down interviews for People magazine and an appearance on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. That same month, work began on season 2.